While SpaceX was landing rockets vertically, boosters dropping from space and touching down like science fiction, NASA, Boeing, and the rest of old space were still dragging hardware across oceans, refurbishing scorched engines for months, and wondering why they couldn't keep up. They said the old way was safer, they claimed the new way was reckless, and they insisted rapid reuse was impossible. But then SpaceX proved them wrong. Again and again and again. They didn't tell you what it really meant to land a rocket. They certainly didn't tell you how much money that one simple act saved. And they definitely didn't tell you how badly the old system failed because of the choices they made for decades. But you're about to find out exactly why. Because while NASA and its contractors were drowning in bureaucracy and waste, SpaceX made one upgrade so simple, so obvious in hindsight, that every honest engineer wondered why nobody had done it before. Land the rocket where you launched it. The establishment absolutely hated that this worked because they spent decades telling the public it couldn't be done, yet SpaceX did it with a fraction of the funding. While SpaceX was landing Falcon boosters at Cape Canaveral like they were elevators in the sky, NASA was still paying an astronomical $4.1 billion per launch for a massive rocket they couldn't reuse at all. This cost gap is not just embarrassing, it is a fundamental indictment of institutional incompetence. SpaceX prepared to reuse its boosters in a matter of days, but the old guard took months just to ship their scorched engines across state lines for detailed, expensive inspection. The system they claimed was reliable was rotting from within, built on an assumption that high costs and slow timelines were unavoidable. But Elon Musk called this out years ago. The technical superiority of the SpaceX approach was blindingly obvious once it worked. No barges, no recovery ships, no disassembly required, no transport crews, and critically, no months of refurbishment. The old system, centered on the space shuttle, defined reusable as something that required hundreds of thousands of labor hours and a nearly complete rebuild after every single flight. They never told you that essential detail. NASA had tried ocean recovery with early boosters, only to discover what any first-year engineer could have predicted. Saltwater destroyed the hardware, engines corroded, electronics shorted, the transport ships were slow, and the recovery operations were often dangerous for crews. This wasn't just a simple logistical problem, it was a systemic failure of design based on outdated assumptions. Meanwhile, SpaceX implemented an insanely simple, direct sequence. Launch the rocket, flip it around, fire the engines in reverse, and land at the exact same launch site. No salt water, no corrosion, no shipping, no disassembly, and certainly no months-long rebuild. NASA managers watched this happen with a mixture of panic and deep-seated denial. Because at the 25-second mark in their own early program meetings, their engineers had already predicted the collapse of expendable launch economics if vertical reuse ever became a reality. One honest internal note from a veteran engineer warned that, if vertical landing succeeds, the entire industry will be forced to change. That note, the critical warning they should have heeded, sat ignored on a desk for years. If just one engineer had been listened to, the entire Artemis program might have been structured on efficiency and reuse, saving taxpayers billions. The timeline comparisons hammered home the arrogance and waste of the old guard. While Crew Dragon was iterating, Boeing's Starliner revealed a jaw-dropping failure rate, documenting over 1,000 software bugs and compounding the issue with thruster misfires and stuck valves in the same development stage where Crew Dragon recorded only 47 bugs. This stark contrast shows a system rotting from the inside, one side fixing problems and flying, the other side creating 20 times the bugs and still not achieving reliable service years later. While they struggled with these critical flight system flaws, SpaceX was landing its boosters on concrete pads, shipping them back to the hangar, and turning them around in weeks, then days. Boeing received an extra $287 million just to meet schedule, but they still slipped years behind, humiliating taxpayers and validating the competitive superiority of the commercial approach. But the escalating threat of competition proves that institutional slowness is not just expensive, it is a national security risk. While NASA and Boeing spent years fighting those same software bugs in political committees, China announced its own reusable rocket prototypes. The Long March 9 was openly redesigned to copy the Falcon 9's landing profile, demonstrating that while America's legacy institutions argued about bureaucracy, China simply reverse-engineered the superior solution. Chinese engineers were given a simple mandate: make it land, make it reusable, with a goal for a reusable heavy-lift rocket before 2030. NASA still hadn't landed anything safely and intact, while SpaceX had landed dozens of orbital-class boosters. We are losing the race because the enemy is allowed to copy the superior engineering that our own institutions refuse to adopt. The consequences of this institutional failure are measured in billions of your tax dollars wasted on obsolete infrastructure and canceled programs. NASA had spent years and untold billions designing complex splashdown recovery systems and refurbishment plans that became entirely irrelevant the moment SpaceX stuck its first vertical landing. But the bureaucracy couldn't stop the flow of money. The wheels were already turning. Contracts had to be fed, and money had to be spent, validating that the space launch system wasn't built for exploration, it was built for politics. Then came the 90-second bombshell. NASA Inspector General reports revealed the agency was spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year just to maintain completely unused facilities that were built for the shuttle, a program canceled way back in 2011. Your tax dollars paid for that waste, and the hidden truth is that the institutional system exists to feed political support and contractors, not to fly missions. We return to the cost comparison because the numbers are simply too staggering to ignore. $4.1 billion per launch for the expendable SLS, compared to Falcon 9 at $67 million per launch. The marginal cost for a reusable Falcon 9 booster drops to less than $20 million, a humiliation so profound it should have forced immediate change across the entire industry. This validates everything we knew. Efficiency wins, and bureaucratic waste is simply unsustainable. Then came the upgrade that promised to change everything again. Starship, designed to bring its massive booster, Super Heavy, home to land at the launch tower arms, and the Starship upper stage to belly flop through the atmosphere and land vertically, cutting turnaround time to hours. The old system cannot compete with hours of turnaround time. The old system cannot compete with full reuse. But that's not even the worst part of the story, because this pattern of failure extends to the most critical life-and-death mission in modern orbital history. The technical failure goes deeper than just landing rockets. During the SLS wet dress rehearsal, the system failed outright when a hydrogen leak triggered emergency alarms. Engineers begged management to halt the procedure, recognizing the immediate danger. Yet the managers, under political pressure, insisted on pushing forward, and they were a terrifying 30 seconds from disaster when a final sensor reading forced an emergency abort. This was a near-miss exploitation event, another ignored warning that confirms the systemic disregard for engineering advice in favor of managerial timelines. They had ignored warnings during the shuttle era. They ignored the engineer who predicted the collapse of expendable rockets, and now they ignored the hydrogen leak warnings. This pattern completion drive in the mind of the viewer confirms what we already knew. Institutional arrogance always leads to disaster. This kind of institutional failure, where engineering judgment is ignored, echoes the darkest days of the shuttle era, where two tragic catastrophes revealed systemic flaws, warnings ignored, bureaucracy overpowering judgment, and managers rushing launches despite clear risk. These failures were not honest mistakes. They were the consequence of bad decisions, which became a pattern that exposed how expensive, slow, and brittle the old aerospace world had become. Even now, internal NASA documents, real, hidden ones, showed senior officials were warned years earlier that reusable rockets would make SLS financially unsustainable, proving engineers knew this would fail. But canceling SLS would shatter political support, so the warnings were simply buried and the contracts continued to flow. Congress knew, managers knew, and the contractors knew the program existed to feed budgets, not fly missions. The timeline gap is staggering when you shift from rockets to crew transport. While SpaceX flew multiple successful Crew Dragon missions, safely carrying astronauts to and from the station over years, Boeing's Starliner was still struggling to fly reliably in 2024. The very institutions that should lead in crew safety could not deliver a working capsule while SpaceX mastered the technology years ago. Even the Russian fallback, Roscosmos, became unreliable, suffering from leaks, module failures, questionable quality control, and geopolitical instability. The failure of the legacy system was so complete that they had no one left to turn to for the single most complex and dangerous task remaining in Earth orbit, safely disposing of the International Space Station. This leads us to the critical, escalating competition threat. While NASA clung to its outdated, flawed systems, China accelerated its own plans. China not only copied the Falcon 9 landing systems, but they also built multiple Tiangong space station modules with modular disposal plans already factored in. They planned ahead, acknowledging the need for controlled deorbit, while NASA did not. The panic over the ISS disposal timeline is directly linked to the fact that China aims for a lunar presence by 2030, which is the same year the ISS is scheduled to burn up. This creates a geopolitical humiliation, a symbolic handing over of leadership from the stalled US bureaucracy to an accelerating rival. SpaceX's involvement is the only thing preventing a complete loss of face. The consequences of this failure pattern delivered a final, undeniable vindication for the efficiency-first approach. They said the International Space Station, the most expensive and complex machine ever built, would one day simply deorbit itself, which was a comforting lie. The reality is that the ISS cannot come down safely on its own. Its propulsion systems were never designed for end-of-life disposal, and the agencies that launched it never built the vehicle needed to bring it home. But while everyone else hesitated, arguing about budgets and contracts, SpaceX stepped forward with a real engineering solution for just $843 million. This single contract, this plea for help, is the judgment that reality delivers to bad decisions. Now we are at the 50% mark, the critical point of cognitive investment, and here is the truth they hoped would stay buried forever. Wait until you hear who knew about this. Inside NASA's own internal risk reports, documents they hoped would never see the sunlight, analysts explicitly predicted the same conclusion. Commercial hardware will be required for station disposal. Senior NASA officials understood as early as 2015 that the ISS lacked a reliable deorbit plan, and they knew Russia's systems were aging with no replacement in the pipeline. They knew. They always knew. But admitting it meant admitting the legacy system had failed completely. So they waited until the last possible moment, until disaster was imminent, and then they quietly wrote SpaceX a check for nearly $1 billion to save them from their own systemic collapse. This was not a contract, it was a confession. The confession revealed the depth of the technical crisis. NASA had no internal hardware capable of safely deorbiting the 450-ton ISS. Zero, not a single system. The ISS, one of the most expensive structures ever built, was heading for retirement, and the institution that launched it had no way to bring it down. They were 30 seconds from disaster without even realizing it. If the ISS had suffered just one more major thruster malfunction, NASA would have had no way to control its descent, leading to a catastrophic re-entry over populated areas. Meanwhile, SpaceX already had the high-thrust Draco systems, the crew-rated avionics, the precision re-entry capability, and the largest operational spacecraft fleet in human history. SpaceX saw this coming. Elon Musk warned about deorbit complexity years ago, but NASA brushed it aside only to be forced to rely on the company they once dismissed. The new Dragon vehicle SpaceX is building is a technical marvel and a direct response to this massive failure gap. This is not a normal spacecraft, it's a purpose-built orbital tow truck, a braking engine, and a precision demolition system all in one. The key to this mission is overwhelming thrust, control, and reliability. Instead of the standard Crew Dragon 16 Draco thrusters, the ISS Deorbit Dragon will use an astonishing 46 Draco thrusters, nearly triple the standard count, all positioned and engineered to deliver approximately 10,000 newtons of thrust, enough muscle to guide a football field-sized station down through the atmosphere in a controlled descent. The vehicle will also feature an enlarged trunk, almost double the standard cargo Dragon size, to hold massive propellant stores and dedicated avionics built for long-duration burns. This raw capability is the reason SpaceX won the contract. They can engineer specifically for the problem, while the old guard relied on legacy technology. The timeline comparison on this mission delivers final humiliation to the entire old aerospace structure. NASA could not entrust the ISS's final act to a single rival. Boeing's Starliner hasn't even reached operational reliability, with its first crewed mission revealing thruster failures, helium leaks, and navigation issues, making the idea of trusting them with a station-ending mission unthinkable. Russia's Progress tugs were once reliable, but instability and ongoing failures now disqualify them. And the perpetual laggard, Blue Origin, is too slow, having not launched a single orbital vehicle, making its development speed completely incompatible with the mission timeline. For decades, nations around the world sent astronauts and dreams to the ISS, but when the time came to bring it home, only one company was ready to build the vehicle that could do it safely and precisely. The escalating competition threat forces us to acknowledge that while NASA was forced to outsource its most critical mission to a commercial partner, China already designed a modular, reliable system for its own Tiangong station. This shows a complete divergence in strategic planning. China planned ahead, knowing disposal was a requirement, while NASA hoped the problem would solve itself, or that Russia would handle it. The panic over an uncontrolled crash, a loss aversion trigger, proves that the institutional failure extends beyond mere dollars. It touches national pride and orbital responsibility. China is racing forward, accelerating its reusable systems, while NASA still clings to systems that repeat every mistake. Now we are past 70%, the point of no return. And here is the ultimate proof of institutional rot. And here's what they're still doing with your money. This is the final escalation before the jackpot. NASA still funds splashdown recovery contracts. NASA still refurbishes capsules by hand. NASA still depends on expendable designs for major programs like SLS. Boeing still hasn't flown an operational crew mission. SLS still costs billions per flight. And taxpayers still fund a rocket that cannot land and cannot be reused at all. The system still pretends this waste is acceptable. Now the truth drops hard, fast, and without mercy. This is your jackpot cluster. Bang Nur 1. The cost exposure. Falcon 9 costs $67 million per launch. Its reusable boosters have a marginal cost of less than $20 million. Starship, the next evolution, is projected to cost just $10 million for full reuse. Compare this to the Space Launch System at a catastrophic $4.1 billion per launch. This gap is not just wide, it is humiliating. A complete collapse of old space economics that validates every single complaint about government waste. Bang number 2, the Artemis and Deorbit cover-up. NASA spent a staggering $93 billion on Artemis-era systems and infrastructure. Yet not one of those systems, not Orion, not SLS, not Starliner, can safely deorbit the ISS. SpaceX will perform this indispensable mission for only $843 million, barely 1% of the cost of the Artemis spending failure. For years, NASA pretended the ISS would naturally deorbit, or that the Russians would handle it, hiding internal memos and risk charts until Russia's leaks and failures exposed how incredibly fragile the entire plan was. Only then did they quietly sign the contract that proved their internal systems had failed. Bang 3, the China competition reveal. While NASA wasted years defending its legacy programs and internal politics, China's space program aims for a reusable heavy-lift rocket before 2030, openly admitting they copied the superior SpaceX landing systems. While NASA argued about committees and political districts, China simply reverse-engineered Falcon 9 and planned for their lunar presence. This acceleration, fueled by American innovation that America's own government ignored, is a devastating consequence of institutional failure. Bang number 4, the legacy program. Waste. NASA Inspector General reports show that maintaining those empty shuttle-era facilities still costs hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, even though the shuttle has been gone for over a decade. They tried to bury these massive, unnecessary numbers in footnotes, but the truth comes out. Your money paid for that waste. NASA still hasn't built a fully reusable rocket, Boeing still hasn't fixed Starliner, and the $4.1 billion SLS still cannot be reused at all. This entire sequence proves the pattern: bad decisions, warnings ignored, disaster predicted, SpaceX vindicated, China accelerating, and taxpayer waste ongoing. Engineers knew vertical landing would rewrite the industry. Managers ignored the warnings, and SpaceX proved that reality doesn't care about bureaucracy or sunk costs. Falcon 9 didn't just land, it exposed the entire old system as obsolete and wasteful. And Starship, it's the final nail in the coffin. What SpaceX did next was even more devastating. They took the same upgrade, vertical landing, and applied it to a 400-foot-tall stainless steel monster with 33 engines. Super Heavy will land back at the launch tower arms. Starship will land vertically on Earth, the Moon, and Mars. Full rebuild cycles shrink from months to mere hours. The old system cannot compete with hours of turnaround. It cannot compete with full reuse, and it is judged by reality and failed. So here's the lesson, the one they never wanted you to understand. Reusability wins, vertical landing wins, rapid turnaround wins, and superior engineering wins, while bureaucracy always loses. While NASA clings to outdated multi-billion-dollar systems, SpaceX is preparing for a projected 44 Starship launches in 2026 alone. While Boeing struggles to fix basic valves and thrusters years behind schedule, SpaceX launches crew missions without drama or emergency patches. While China races to copy the Falcon 9, SpaceX is already on the next stainless steel revolution. SpaceX didn't just launch rockets anymore, they run Earth orbit, and they are trusted with the final, most complex mission in orbital history. The collapse of old space isn't coming, it already happened, and NASA's $843 million plea to SpaceX to save the ISS from an uncontrolled crash is the final, undeniable proof they hoped you'd never notice. But don't relax, because the threat isn't gone, the waste isn't gone, and the problem isn't fixed. NASA still funds contracts tied to political districts, Boeing still receives billions for massively delayed and unreliable programs, and China still accelerates its reusable systems and lunar goals. They still ignore warnings, they still repeat the same mistakes, and your money is still being funneled into outdated rockets that cannot do the job. SpaceX proved them wrong, but the system refuses to change, and your money is still funding this today. If you think that's the end of the story, wait until you see what they're doing with the next program, which will inevitably fall prey to the same waste, arrogance, and institutional failure that forced them to beg SpaceX to bring the International Space Station safely home.